Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Keiser Education Series. My name is Gabe Durman, and I'm a Human Performance and Education Specialist at Keiser. I'll be moderating today's panel alongside my teammate, Mike Compton. Today's discussion is centered around the application of plyometrics in sport performance. We are grateful to have two awesome performance coaches joining us on the K.E.S. They have great experience, their resumes speak for themselves, and we're excited to sit down and learn from them tonight. Our first panelist is Dan Riddenhauer. Dan currently serves as the Assistant of Player Performance and Sports Science Coordinator for the Minnesota Vikings. Prior to his current position, Dan was the Assistant Director at the Nebraska Athletic Performance Lab. Preceding his time at Nebraska, he served as the Director of Athletic Performance at Wilmington College, coaching athletes from 23 different sports. Dan earned his bachelor's from Luther College, his master's in exercise science from the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and is currently pursuing a professional doctorate through the University of Limerick. Our second panelist is Dr. Ramsey Nigem. Dr. Nijem is a high-performance coach and educator with over a decade of experience training some of the world's best athletes. He currently is the Director of Performance for men's basketball at the University of Kansas and previously served as the head strength conditioning coach for the NBA's Sacramento Kings. Dr. Nijem founded the Applied Performance Coach Certification and Mentorship Program, where he educates hundreds of coaches and is a consultant to some of the biggest names in health, performance, and fitness. To learn more about his certification and mentorship, you can visit www.appliedperformancecoach.com. We'll make sure to include the link here and in the published episode. Welcome, Dan and Ramsey. We're pumped to have you here with us and ready to get started. Dan, congrats on the fairly new position in Minnesota. Ramsey, congrats on the national championship and not one, but two first-round draft picks in the recent NBA draft. What a run for Kansas basketball. And while I'm sure you have some great memories from last season, I know summer training has started and the focus has shifted to next season in Lawrence. 2 weeks ago, we had Molly Benetti from South Carolina on with us. So now back-to-back episodes of the Keiser Education Series with the strength and conditioning coaches for both the men's and women's NCAA basketball champions. Pretty cool stuff there. A reminder for all our attendees, you can drop any questions you have in the chat, and we'll allot some time at the end of the discussion to address them to our two panelists. So, all right, let's go. K.E.S. is underway. The first question I have is for the both of you. We'll start with Ramsey, and then Dan will make sure to give you a chance to answer as well. My first question is centered around the classification of plyometric exercises. In other words, you have all these plyometric exercises to choose from: in place, hopping, skipping, single leg, double leg, depth drop, and so on. We're curious to know how you organize all these exercises and the intensities of them. Ramsey, we'll start with you.
Yeah, of course. There's certainly no shortage of options somebody would have. But when I kind of just begin to think about classifying or categorizing or ultimately the progression of these things, obviously amplitude comes to mind. And so that can be measured by a few different kind of lenses, right? You can look at the height somebody's reaching, or you can look at maybe the depth they're dropping from. Keeping in mind, though, plyometric, you're going to need a stretch shortening cycle kind of action going on there. But I think of amplitude, I think of distance or depth, I think of velocity, obviously bilateral, unilateral. And then I kind of have general rules around kind of just those concepts, right? So, when our guys come in, for example, June, our big kind of off season starts in June and progresses through essentially September, really. But, I think breaks before gas is something that I've said before. And so I want to build the ability to control eccentric forces before I introduce, these big forces that we ultimately want to turn around, right? The end goal in plyometric training is that you eccentrically lengthen and then you turn that around for a propulsive action. And so, if you don't have brakes before gas, what you may be doing, maybe your athlete some harm. I think sagittal before frontal or transverse, right? Like if you're not good in sagittal plane, I'm just not going to bet my money on it that you're good at frontal or transverse actions, right? I think control before chaos. And so, an example of that might be is pre-planned. So maybe we're going to do a snap down to a hold. And when I say go, you're going to jump and then you're going to land and hold that same kind of position. Well, that's pre-planned. I'm going to tell you we're going to do that. And obviously, eventually, maybe I'm standing behind you. You don't see me. And now it's just a vocal cue. And you don't know when those things are coming. So I think control before plan. And then it gets into the more kind of, I think, in the weeds of plyometrics, right? Of how you're breaking this thing down. And so before I jump into there, I'll, pause and give Dan a chance to jump in. But those are just some ideas that come to mind, when you think about the categorization or classification of these things.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. I like to start vertical, vertical and especially in the sagittal plane, and then you can start working on some horizontal translation because really all exercises are kind of gaming different joint angles with intensities, velocities, durations, angle of insult. So how are you going to subject the athlete and the athlete's tissues to force? And vertical tends to be something that, kind of to your point, if they can't handle vertical, I'm not touching horizontal or lateral or rotational or chaotic with a 40-foot pole, right? So I want to start there. I want to start decelerating. Can they brake effectively? And then from there, it's like anything else, like it becomes its own screen. So if can they decelerate, and if their feet fly out and their knees collapse in, well, that kid is not doing hardcore horizontal jumps or whatever, right? Like we need some dorsiflexion work, we need some knee control work, things like that. And then I really like to just start to that same point. In an early phase, if you're just starting with someone, I think it's important, like you said, with the stretch shortening cycle, but making sure you cover your bases. Long stretch shortening cycle, short stretch shortening cycle, dosing them with some elastic, dosing them with some more compliant ones where they can spend some time on the ground. And then you can kind of start to identify who are your workhorses, who are your greyhounds, and then start to kind of cut it up. And to that point, I think early on, the deceleration, some easy rudiment type jumps, and then just starting to dose them with these positions and lay that foundation and give you a place to go.
Yeah, Dan, you killed that. And you said a word there that really resonated, this idea of gaming it, right? Like ultimately, I think there's two things there. Like one, have fun with it, but also we want it to transfer to sport, which is ultimately the game. So I really do like that term. And if someone ever hears me say it, just know credit to Dan for it.
Yeah. So a couple of things that, in listening to your answers, the commonalities there, the eccentric portion first, right? Being able to control, Ramsey, you say control before chaos. Both of you mentioned sagittal plane and maybe starting with some of the pre-planned. If we look, it's a fairly broad question to ask, hey, early off season, what are you doing, or what is appropriate for training? But if we make it maybe a little bit more specific, and we'll go to Ramsey here, and Dan, you hit a little bit on some of the early things you like to do. Let's take a basketball player, freshman in college, which is a scenario you get pretty often, at least once a year. Where are you starting? And you hit on snap downs a little bit. Is that an area where you like to focus in the beginning? And if so, how long and what does that look like? Give us some insight into that.
Yeah, absolutely. We start with snap downs, and it's a bilateral tall snap down. So when I say tall, I think hands overhead extended and then onto the toes, snap down in, and obviously hold that bottom position. And I'm cueing a braking system there. Like I don't want them to actually be too compliant with that. It shouldn't look like a yielding kind of vehicle, right? Like as soon as you hit, I want you to stop. And there's times where you want to yield, and to Dan's credit, right, you could talk about kind of longer or short stretch shortening cycles, but we'll start with a bilateral snap down, and then eventually we snap down. We start bilateral, but we'll snap down into a unilateral either side, and I actually cue a shift over to that side. So I actually want to see, for example, some internal rotation and get all load over that leg. But then we're pairing that. It's not that we're just going to work on the brakes. We're also jump roping and doing pogos throughout the month of June. So we're building the brakes on one side, but then we're building with extensive plyos. To me, a jump rope is the best extensive plyo you can do because it's low amplitude. You're going to get a lot of repetitions in. It's fundamentally a good athletic kind of test, right? Like, can you jump rope? Can you hit the ground? You're working on ground contact. So many good athletes, quote unquote, you put a jump rope in your hand, and I'm blown away at how uncoordinated they are, right? Or their feet are kicking behind them. So we're working on the jump rope with the snap down. The jump rope starts bilateral. The pogo start bilateral. And then we'll go to alternating, and then eventually truly unilateral. So we're going to build kind of the extensive stretch shortening cycle on one end, and we're going to build the brakes of kind of the big muscles there on the other side. And then they'll start to merge in June. So now come June, we're now actually going to be doing our counter movement jumps, which you might classify as like a long stretch shortening cycle versus like a depth jump, which really won't come until we kind of get back after August. August, they go home for 3 weeks. And then when they come back, it's like, all right, now we're looking at that first game. Now we're looking at really tuning this thing up. And that's when depth jumps and the fun Instagram stuff happens. But we don't get there until probably a solid 10 to 12 weeks.
Yeah. And Dan, go ahead if you want to comment a little bit on, from a field sport athlete, uh, context, early off season, or kind of first things you're looking for? You mentioned a little bit about the long versus short, how much time are you spending building one versus the other, especially early on, and then kind of progressing forward early off season.
Yeah, I mean, kind of to Ramsey's point, I don't think you want to take away everything. I think or take away something entirely. I think you do want to have something dosed in. So yeah, can they snap down and decelerate in a bilateral stance? Can they do it in a lunge stance? But then, like I said, on the back end, we might do rudiment. We might just kind of build in these multi-directional, multi-planar movements that build in some component of hip control, build in some component of foot and ankle stability. And are they able to hold these postures in a repeated fashion for 5 reps, for 10 reps? Can they do it in place? Okay. I mean, a lot of times for me in early off season, it's been, okay, we're going to do bilateral forward, smooth jumps. I want good foot contacts. I want good postures. You're yielding at the ankle, knee, hip in similar angles the whole way. And I'm going to walk. And you can't pass my pace of walking. It's just got to be a smooth, controlled thing, because these guys, they're hyper competitive. They're hyper, especially elastic athletes. That's the things they're good at. So they want to start really getting after it, right? So you got to spend a lot of time pulling the brakes and making sure that they can lay down a sound foundation. So I do like to start very, very similar to what you're talking. We got to hit position first. We got to make sure that they can control and own these positions. And then when you build out, then it's going to start adding, can we do a single response, a full effort? Okay, 1, let's reset. We'll do a full go. Okay. Can we do back to back after a week or 2 of that? Can we do back to back to back? Can we do transitional ones, lateral to forward, vertical to horizontal? And then you're starting to, like you're saying, now we're starting to push the needle towards, we got to get ready for games at the end of the day. And none of our sports are purely vertical. None of them are purely horizontal, right? Like there's components on each of them. So the athletes have to be able to have, in chaotic sports, at least, ability to, handle different directions and things that you can't really prepare for, but you can at least get them used to how they can handle the base positions in all of these.
So one of the things I'll ask, though, is as a coach, watching them, as a practitioner, following them from the early off season, as you move forward, right? You see them doing their sport and performing on the court or on the field as well during that time. Doesn't need to be the entire checklist, but as you go forward, you say, okay, this athlete needs to be able to do X or needs to be able to do Y. Like, can you share some of those things as a checklist as a coach, whether it's visual or some you have written down, like, okay, this is how I know and can actually say for sure that they can handle this? And I'll leave it up to either of you if one of you wants to start with that.
Yeah, like for me, I mean, I'm big into the force plate side of it. So I use that a lot as a screening mechanism, but also everything's a screen, and I think the easiest example for a lot of this is in a return to play context. You've heard the phrase, and I got it from Sean Mishka back in the day, the best athletes are the best compensators. When I first heard that, I thought that meant everyone compensates. So there's always something to coach. And then I kind of built out and then like, well, if everyone compensates and only some people get hurt, maybe there's other people. But now I kind of view it a lot more in the return to play context of, a lot of these people are so athletic that even if you have 1.5 legs, a lot of them are still really, really talented and they can still piece it together. So like an athlete who's really limited in a knee or something like that, they need to be able to move out of deeper angles of knee flexion or something like that. But a lot of them are so skilled that they'll game it so that they can still land a really stiff legged, so they don't have to actually break and yield at a deeper knee bend type of angle like that. That's a short example, but there's a million pieces to it. They have to be, a receiver has to be able to go up and get a ball. They have to be able to go do a cut route, make a cut, go up vertical, and then make another cut off of the landing. Things along those lines. A running back might keep it a little bit more horizontally based or low to the ground, but they have to be able to slam on the brakes, re-accelerate, shift, So it's really, at the end of the day, a lot of it ends up coming back to the same things of, these are 3 planes. We got to be able to handle just different combinations. And like to Rand's point earlier, it's got to get chaotic at some point. Like if they can predict the whole drill, then we aren't really, really getting and simulating what we need to.
Yeah, completely agree, Dan. And then, maybe just to add to it, force plates are going to give us a lot of kind of deep information, right? Especially involving the kinetics of kind of what's going on. And when Dan talks about, these athletes are great at compensating, you're on 1.5 leg, you may still be able to reach the same jump height, right? But there's 10 other metrics that we may want to consider, right? And then obviously getting asymmetry. So there's a whole kind of kinetic discussion. And then kinematically, which you can get some of it with a force plate, right? You're going to get the depth, for example, and that's something we'll look at, especially in a return to play. But just with the coach's eye, right? For those who are listening who don't have those things, it's like, what are we looking at when we say control? What's happening at the ankle, knee, and hip? What's happening at the trunk? Every time that I ask you to snap down, you fold over at the trunk and you just have nothing going on. That's going to take us a long time to get out of. And while we're getting out of that, we're probably losing some of the force that we're trying to turn around. And so, I just start to look at whether it's sagittal, frontal, transverse, it really doesn't matter. It's ultimately, is this athlete moving how we want to see? And are we seeing good angles? Are we seeing good stacking? Are we seeing, now there's bandwidth, right? And that's a term Altus thing is used, and I'm a fan of that idea. There's bandwidth with that. So everyone's not going to fit a model per se, but if every time I ask you to change direction and slide out of this thing, your trunk folds over laterally, and now your center of mass is outside the base of support, you're either going to fall over or you're just going to take forever to get back to where we need to go. And so those are things that I look for. It's ultimately, how are you controlling and navigating gravity to ultimately get back? And obviously the stretch shortening cycle and plyometrics is going to fit within all of that, but it probably starts with even maybe some underpinning qualities, right? Like if your trunk is always swaying, is it trunk control? Is that a motor pattern problem? Is it actually just a core or strength problem? Is it a teaching problem? Like you don't know what you're doing. So there's a lot to unpack. And so as a coach, you just look and say, I don't know what's going on here, but I see that your trunk is outside of your hips and you're getting beat every time. We better figure that out. And then obviously you go into the weight room and we problem solve. So yeah, I think there's a kinetic discussion and having force plates, and we have them too, and we're fortunate to be able to do that. But if you're coaching youth athletes, ground contact, you can hear it. Like you sound like you take forever on the ground. I'm not even looking, I just hear it. And all these other athletes are beating you and they sound better, right? You can hear some of that. So yeah, I think that's just that coach's eye, I guess. And if you have tech that allows you to kind of inform those decisions, even better for sure.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think we're going to get to the force plate in a second. I know Dan, you had mentioned that, and then Ramsey, you said that you have that as well. So let's definitely get into that. Just before we do though, my question for Ramsey is, what kind of video, are you taking video while these guys are on the court? Are you watching the court video as well, to actually see, okay, this is what's happening on the sport? And are you taking video of your own when you're doing any sort of on-court plyo, slide, shuffles, things like that?
I don't do that now. That was a practice that we did as far as taking video in our weight room or with some of our movement stuff. We'll do slow-mos of some of our acceleration work and stuff like that. But that stuff doesn't heavily inform. We watch a ton of film, obviously, right? Like it's college basketball. I mean, even the NBA, you're going to watch film. And so I do watch a ton of film. And that informs a lot of what we do just based off conversations with our sport coaches, with our athlete. I know the game enough to be dangerous where I understand what we're looking at and why that's probably not good for you and why if we change it to this, that's probably going to help you. So we watch a lot of the sport film and obviously watch almost every rep in practice or a game. But I used to actually do a ton of filming in the weight room. And what I found personally is that unless you have an intern or a grad assistant or someone who can hold it for you, I found myself worried about catching content or catching film and not coaching movement. And so I moved away from that personally. But if I had 10 interns, I certainly would probably tell one to film everything and review later, but I'm just not in a position to do that now.
Yeah. And then one more kind of quick question before we head over to the force plate question is, how about from a cueing standpoint? You had mentioned cueing a couple of times. Let's just start with like bilateral snap down from the start. Like, what are your go-to cues? Are they external, internal? What are you saying to your athletes? And maybe that's a little bit a nugget that some of our practitioners can kind of take home or at least learn from.
Yeah, for sure. From our snap down, we always cue tall and we just say go. And when we say go, I want you to snap down as hard as you can. And I use the analogy of braking. I actually use the analogy of a driver's license for the whole kind of conversation around this. And so my athletes begin to understand, like, okay, a driver's license means I know how to drive. Well, okay, I can control this vehicle, right, which is your human system. And then I talk about braking. Like, I want you to slam on the brakes There's athletes that yield, and I tell them, it's like, look, as soon as your feet hit, I'm watching your hips slowly drop. This should be more like an e-brake. As soon as the feet hit, I want you to pull that e-brake, and I shouldn't see much movement. You'll see a little bit, obviously, because the system has to stiffen up, but I don't want to see these gross movement changes at the knee or hip, or you won't see them at the ankle much. But so yeah, I just talk about the e-brake system, and I think that resonates decently well with athletes. So you might call that an external cue, really, because you're not talking anything internal. But yeah, that's what I kind of go with.
Yeah, I'm always interested to hear what kind of cueing people are using. I know snap downs, a lot of people are doing them, and especially early off season. Dan, let's shift to some of the force plate information that you're getting over with the Minnesota Vikings, and maybe some of the stuff you've previously done with the Nebraska Athletic Lab, as it relates to some of the signatures of athletes or gaining understanding of what this athlete might need. What are some of the metrics that you like looking at and things that are helpful for you in making informed decisions?
Yeah. So, with the Vikings, I'm pretty new, so we've been able to implement some things, but a lot of the stuff where I really cut my teeth was, rolling it out with, well, that was what was really cool at Nebraska is, you're getting jumps. I think in a year and a half, 2 years, we got over 50,000 trials on the force deck. So and then some of them and a lot of it was unilateral, a lot of it was elastic jumps, and a lot of it was counter movements, and some of it was ash test with the shoulder. So you do start to be able to see these profiles of what kind of athletes love the ground and which kind of athletes can get out of it. So, so I think, so I'm going to zoom out a second on that. So, because for metrics, the first thing is, well, which test? Which tests are we looking at? There's performance metrics that we want to look at in terms of if you want to view them like benchmarks, that if there's a team average or something like that, what does a starter look like versus a non-starter? For performance, you can look at RSI, say we're looking at counter movement jump. I think a lot of people look at RSI mod as a lot of times like a fatigue metric, but also that's really, an athlete can change that up based on strategy a lot, whether they're compliant or not compliant. So then I like to compare that with jump height. So you still have an overall output measure. So if someone does just a really quick drop in and get out, their RSI might spike, but their jump doesn't, and for people who haven't interacted, that's just time on the ground versus time in the air. It's how much bang for your buck and the efficiency of the jump. Peak power for body mass is a good one. And then from there, for counter movement, then you can start looking for asymmetries. And to Ramsey's point, all of these tests and metrics, there's a million of them, and a lot of them are visual. So that's, I think what really helps is you can see them do the test, and you have to be consistent on how you do the assessment. But you can see that athlete does this and their curve looks like this. They move like this, their curve looks like this. Why? So if they shift, well, you'll see these lines start to get away. If they shift on the loading phase, you'll see it, okay, well, maybe there's a gap in their knee. Maybe there's a gap in their hip. Are they able to drop in? Are they able to sink in? So you can start looking at braking, deceleration, there's the force at zero velocity people like that, but it's really more about just trying to build. I like to use back when masking was first becoming a thing with COVID, the Swiss cheese thing. I think that's a really valuable analogy, because each test is one thing that I've learned over the years is that each test is only a reflection of that athlete on that test at that moment. So you want to build a good background of data on these. So if an athlete comes in on test day and they're trashed, well, their numbers aren't going to be very good on the force plate. That doesn't mean they're a trash athlete. It means they had a bad day. And so, okay, well, let's just kind of diversify our bonds here with the jump testing. So we got counter movement, which is a slow stretch shortening cycle. The contraction times are anywhere from 0.4 to 0.75 seconds, depending on the athlete. It's a deeper knee bend. There's a unilateral jump, which is an even longer ground contact times. It's higher forces out of the single leg and the knee. And then you got like an elastic test, which is much faster. So then you're really starting to triangulate, and then you can compare it with change of direction. You can compare it with absolute strength, and then you can start to build out your own profile of what these athletes look like. Because obviously an elastic test, you don't want a very compliant movement. You want them to be able to get in off the ground really fast. On the single leg jump, maybe you're gearing towards height, but you also, are they dropping into their knee, or are they hip hinging? Katsufaki has written a lot of good research recently showing the horizontal, the triple jump or whatever for distance, you can, again, to our point of the compensation, you can really get around that if you're limited in a knee by just doing more hip hinge. So you always want your coach's eye geared up with it. And then from there, some of the metrics carry over, but you start to piece it together. What are the good athletes really showing? And that's usually the power metrics, the jump metrics, the deceleration aspects. And then you can start to build an individual profile on each guy on what their drivers are with their injury histories and whatever.
Yeah. And I think in a little bit, we'll talk about the different types of athletes within the same sport, like your force bias athletes, your speed bias athletes. So we'll definitely get to that. So it's a nice precursor to that. Ramsey, how about on your end with Kansas and force plates? You mentioned you use them. To what degree, and what are you looking for when you see, when you have an athlete come in and you begin testing on an athlete and over time, and how does that aid in the prescription of maybe your plyometric training?
Yeah, good question. So we do use force plates. We jump once a week, and we're super consistent with that. From there, what we do is we're able to build out, and I'm fortunate to say we, because we have a prestigious sports science lab here that basically delivers me PhD students that help. And so my PhD student now is a total stud, and we kind of have a few things going on at once, right? One is like our kind of acute feedback mechanisms. We're going to jump you, and right after that session, they go to practice. We're going to jump on the computer. We're going to look and kind of see where are we at. And we'll never base too many decisions off of that conversation. We might red flag and know and say, well, let's see what happens next week on that. Or he complained of this. Let's pull him in here on a few days. So that's always bilateral. We have some injured cases, right? Because ultimately, as Dan was speaking, I thought you did a great job with that. It's ultimately what we're trying to do is build a deep needs analysis around each individual athlete. And then one step over is like, now give them an individual program. And so any athlete that comes in with different things, we're going to do a few more kind of tests. And so like we have a guy now, and it starts with the bilateral. We saw some things there. Case in point, we see that he doesn't load eccentrically well relative to his propulsive kind of metrics, right? And so he said, why is that? Is it because his propulsive is just through the roof and his eccentric stacks against the rest of the team fairly well? And that may or may not be good, right? That because if you can produce a lot, we talk about the brakes versus gas. It's like he could step on the gas really well, but for some reason the brakes aren't here. What's going on there? Let's go into a true unit, because we have bilateral force plates, and then it sounds like you do as well, obviously. So you're getting asymmetries from bilateral movement, but that becomes to me more of a preference conversation, right? How does the body choose to load asymmetry within a bilateral task? But let's deep dive. So then what we'll do is we'll do a unilateral counter movement jump. There's pros and cons to that, like Dan mentioned, right? A longer contact time, but obviously more force out of that unilateral leg. But now you don't have the option to get to the other leg. So it's when we put this limb by itself, what is it going to do? And then we'll do a few other tests we've played around with, and I've played around with my career. Not necessarily isometric mid-thigh pull, but we'll put a trap bar underneath the safety pins, and we'll do an isometric mid-thigh pull that way. We actually found in the NBA, I wasn't a huge fan of that test. There's a lot of challenges with isometric mid-thigh pulls, as we know. But what we found, we just looked at other metrics to decide this. So for example, when we did our isometric mid-thigh pull with our NBA guys, we looked at a dynamic strength index. And what we found was that they're actually producing more force in their counter movement jump, but that doesn't make sense to us because it should be greater in isometric. So to me, that's not actually, all we're showing is that they're not pulling a lot of force here. That's probably a reflection of our programming, their preference, their comfortability with that. We didn't tape their hands. There's a ton there. So we shifted, and we might have been one of the first in the league. A bunch of people do it now, but we created this in-house belt squat version. And I think Val just put out kind of a system for it. We just built this thing and we threw our athletes on it, and we saw around 20 to 30% greater forces in a bilateral isometric squat. Similar knee angles though. So that told me a little bit of information about kind of that test. So we tried to deep dive on all of this ultimately, but the bilateral counter movement jump is the big one. And then ultimately, how do we use that? We have to comp against a few things. Obviously I can make some phone calls to my guys in the NBA. We'll look at some of those gaps. But the easy one is we comp to some of our guys in-house. So like we had a player, Ochai Abaji, who just won the lottery, by far the best athlete on the team last year. He became our model citizen. let's look like Ochai. Now everyone's not going to look like that, obviously, but and then you build quartiles out. And so, all the stuff that Dan I'm sure he's doing, it influenced the program. And let me give you an example, because I know that we could talk abstract. Let me give you an example. Here's one. We created 4 groups last year relative to our high minute guys. And so one of the groups became a group that lacked braking forces. And so there was only 3 players in that group, but we decided to give them an actual exercise to intervene into this thing and develop this capacity. And you might call them reactive or reflexive eccentrics. We put a trap bar in their hand. We loaded it with their body weight. We told them to stand tall. And the same idea of a snap down, I want you to drop, catch, and stick as hard as you can. And we did that for 8 weeks, and we only did it on one day. And then we retested, and we saw that those metrics actually improved. And so, it's a long way to say that we're going to use it. It's going to influence the programming. But ultimately, we always want to obviously look at the game, right? Now, last year, we were in a fortunate position where our best athlete was also our best player, who also won the lottery. And those things don't always happen, as we know. But when it does, it's nice to now model everybody against that. Let me take a breather. I feel like I just kind of gave y'all out there.
I'm going to quickly jump in here. And Ramsey, you touched on it briefly with the influence of the program, but I guess we'll give you a second to catch up, catch your breath, and then flick it over to you, Dan. So are you taking those metrics and those findings from the technology to help either reiterate that your progressions in plyos is on point, or are you supplementing, all right, this athlete, he's, trending appropriately. He's, moving forward a little bit faster. So let's skip a couple steps. Or are you still sticking to the mindset of, hey, these are the progressions we need to take in plyos, which is going to be a little bit slightly than, let's say, strength training. Yeah. So if you could elaborate a little bit on that, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yeah. Like I think you do want to have a good base with like a freshman or a new athlete who you're not really familiar with. And then, but once you are able to kind of get an idea of them, older athletes with a long training legacy, they probably don't need a massive general phase. By that point, you can start to target any discrepancies, a way that we were doing it, that we started kicking it around at Nebraska. And then I had to hop in and be a strength coach from time to time at Nebraska. I wasn't just doing sports science, which was fun. It keeps your foot in the door. One thing that like we were doing at one point was we would just do a rotating bandwidth of twice a week jumps. So Monday we would do a counter movement jump. Friday we would do a single leg jump. The next Monday we would do a 10-5. The next Friday we would do a counter movement jump, and we're just rotating through. So we're getting our slow stretch shortening cycle, bilateral, slow stretch shortening cycle, unilateral, elastic, and kind of wheeling through it. And it was something that, and we chose the 10-5 or the hop test or whatever people want to call it. We chose it because it was fast. We didn't have many other, but then eventually you start to build out power complexes is what we called it. And so the beginning of their workout program, somewhat what Ramsey was talking about, if they're showing gaps, whether that's asymmetry wise or in terms of hitting a benchmark, then we probably want to target their power training. They might still be doing some of these lower. That's the cool thing about plyometrics, or one of the cool things is that like it's very much it's a neural stimulus. No one's getting hypertrophy off this stuff, right? So the learning curve in terms of their ability to adapt to it is very fast in my experience. So like an athlete who needs more elastic ability, say they have an RSI, reactive strength index off of an elastic test, 1.5, we want that higher into the 2s if they're that type of athlete. Well, then we might be back to we're doing jump ropes. We're doing in-place jump circuits. Maybe they're doing drop jumps as part of their power training, where someone else who doesn't have a lot of horsepower from a unilateral, a single leg counter movement jump or whatever, they can't. Well, maybe they're doing either an accentuated eccentric lunge jump or a cycle split or something along those lines. So that way, I think there's a big piece of that of, one, we can always kind of be going back to some of our certain metrics. What does their deceleration rate of force development look like? What does their force at zero velocity asymmetry look like? Or landing. A lot of times landing is a big one. And especially if you have enough bandwidth on the or a testing background, and that that's a consistent asymmetry, because some of these metrics are more variable. So you don't want to put a whole lot of weight on one single measurement. You want to do it consistently and see what their normal is, or what their bandwidth of normal is. But then there's multiple pieces. You can isolate the metrics that are important for them, and then you tell them that, And there is something to that, whether it's, the placebo effect is still in effect. To the athlete, in any supplement or drug would be the hottest selling supplement in the world if it gave you the effects of the placebo effect. And there's something important to telling the athlete, hey, this specific program and this part of it, this is for you. And it's based on this information that I am showing you. So there becomes a quality control. And in my experience, it helps with buy-in, because then, I think people want to put the onus on the athletes a lot, but sometimes if they feel like they're just on this death march doing the same stuff over and over, and there's not an individualized component to it, and they aren't just another cog in the machine, their buy-in helps more and their aspects help more, and they can see the curves, and it's not just, yeah, you look better, man. It's here's the specific things and look how much you've improved over time.
Yeah, education, feedback to the athlete is key and essential. Ramsey, anything to quickly add? And then Gabe, I'll flick it back to you. Thank you.
No, man, I thought Dan did a great job with that. And obviously, like, the placebo effect is, if you're talking research and you're talking medicine, we need a control for that, because we want to know if this drug really works. If you're talking programming and coaching, I want the outcome to change. And whether my program gets there or your buy-in gets us there, whatever gets us there, I want to see these things change. And so if we can change them, even down to a metric on the force plate, if we're confident in that metric, then we should be confident that it's going to ultimately, it's underpinning a sport performance, right? Whether it's a task like jumping, sprinting, or cutting, or the overall performance of, hey, you didn't jump any higher, but for some reason you get more rebounds. Maybe you're quicker off the ground, whatever it is. Those are so when we think placebo in sport now, you don't want nocebo. You don't want bad things to happen. You don't want it to be a crutch, right? There's a deeper conversation. But for the most part, tell your athletes why they're doing it, inform them. And when they buy in, it's going to help your program. And shocker, you'll look better as a performance coach. So we're all for all of that, right?
Yeah, thank you both for the feedback. I think one of the common themes we've had with our guests over the last few months we've been doing this is the key to a lot of this is just athlete education. The people have been doing it really well, and being able to get buy-in by really doing a great job of educating the athlete on why they're doing things is really assisted in the training process and then ultimately achieving the desired outcomes. So let's continue with the individualized approach. And we talked a little bit about the assessment of that. Let's talk about plyometric prescription for different types of athletes within the same sport. So, right, we know that power is a function of force and velocity. So is there any difference in how your program for plyos looks for an athlete that's force bias versus an athlete with a speed bias, right? And Ramsey, I think you have about 14 to 15 or so athletes. Is that right?
Yeah,
So,
17,
right.
17
yeah,
to
okay.
18 now.
17 to 18 now. So within that 17 to 18, right, you have 17 to 18 individuals. Some may be similar, some may be different. But then after, I guess, you've created this baseline or sufficient base for plyometric work, what does that look like for athletes if you identified, okay, their speed bias versus force bias?
Yeah, I mean, we do a couple things with that. And the big one that I've done and did actually my first year here was a true force velocity profile, and that's JB Burns' work. I don't do that anymore. And I think some kind of new research questioned it. And then I also just went and redid the test a bunch of different ways. I'm like, yeah, I see why. And long story short, because it's a regression model, if one of your data points is off, your entire model's off. And so I moved away from that. But when I first got here, that's what we did is we just force velocity profiled them. We grouped them in 3 groups. You were a force deficit, you were a velocity deficit, or you're a well-balanced guy. And I like the idea of deficit a little bit better than I think force or speed bias, because ultimately my goal is probably just to bring up what you're limited in. And so the idea of deficit, I think, just resonates a little bit more with me versus if somebody is strength biased, you might say, well, that's fine because they're strong, but I want to bring up your deficits. And if we can get you there based on the literature and based on the physics, the idea is that if we can create a well-balanced athlete, your performance should go up independent of kind of the actual speed or the force there. So we broke them into groups, and then our obviously velocity deficit guys, they got a mixture of long and short kind of stretch shortening cycle and then different loads. We just kind of attacked it from a few different angles. We didn't use the plates to necessarily categorize within there who needed long or who needed short, right? And that's probably a better way to do it, honestly, right? We didn't get to that level. And now that I have kind of a PhD student who helps me with time, we just model based off of our guys, and we just go from there. And we basically bucket into like 3 or 4 groups. And if you're a group that needs some of this stretch shortening cycle, some of this speed stuff, then you're just going to do some different variations of it. But an easy one that I always like to share with coaches that don't have some of, a force plate, for example, is you can do something like an eccentric utilization ratio. And that's pretty much cheap and free. I popped into the chat. I seen somebody talked about the My Jump app. It's a cheap app, download it, or get a Vertec. It doesn't really matter. Just control for hip height, do a squat jump, do a counter movement jump. The counter movement jump divided by the squat jump is going to give you a ratio. And if you can get, the idea is around 1.2, right? And so if you're not at 1.2, if you're not getting at least 20% more out of your stretch shortening cycle, and in this case, a long stretch shortening cycle, then you might need more of that stuff, right? And so it's go out and do more of that stuff. But that's how I would look at it. And then I would probably pass it to Dan now, who could probably give you a better answer on some of the deeper dive there. But I do think from a coaching perspective, an EUR is so easy for people to go out and use. There's limitations in it, but start there, right? If somebody's counter movement jump and their squat jump are very close to each other, it probably means they're not getting a ton out of the stretch shortening cycle. So figure out why, or better yet, even if you don't know like the mechanism behind it, just give them stretch shortening cycle things and see if you can widen that gap. Now the goal isn't to widen the gap because you make their squat jump go down, make them all go up, right? But ultimately you want to, I would argue you want to get at least 15 to 30% out of that thing. And if you're not, there's a reason, and try to uncover that. But Dan, I'll pass to you on that one.
No, I think you nailed it. And the eccentric utilization ratio is something I used with Mike back at St. John's. I mean, it's awesome, because it makes sense. It makes sense to the athletes. It's free. There's a lot of good pieces to it. But I think it kind of goes back to a point you alluded to there. It kind of comes back to your assessment. If you have a horizontal jump, a vertical jump, a throw, everything that you do in your program is an assessment in itself. So if an athlete, if they squat the house and an assessment tells me they're at a force deficit, I'm probably going to pull back a little. If I have a test that says one of our best athletes is not powerful, well, I'm questioning the test more than I'm questioning the athlete, right? If it's someone who's clearly really twitchy and really, really type 2, like, at a certain point, we got to play the logic game. If we're working with a receiver who's all pro caliber at the college, if they're an all conference, whatever, and they're this fast or whatever, they're probably not at a velocity deficit, like maybe there's aspects that we can start to game. Maybe there's different movement competencies that they can still tweak. But at the end of the day, we got to keep the main thing, right? So I think if you're varying your testing approach, but always understanding that all of these are different abilities. A long stretch shortening cycle is different from a short stretch shortening cycle, which is different from absolute strength, which is different from motor coordination and a bunch of different patterns. So I don't think you want to cut it up so much where, oh, well, here's what we're going to do for plyometrics based on this one single assessment. I think you want, like I said, you always want to kind of keep the whole picture in view, because, in team sports, there isn't just one aspect. If you're working with a track and field, you can start breaking it down. What's their 10 versus what's their, 60. And we can start, looking at acceleration versus top end, whatever. But to kind of actually answer the actual question, I think that's where it starts to get important of having a multifaceted battery and then having thresholds that you want to hit. If an athlete scores very poorly on a reactive strength index on an elastic test, their top end probably isn't there. And then from there, it's a decision for you as a practitioner to say, is this an athlete who needs it? I'm not losing sleep on an offensive lineman who doesn't have great elastic qualities. They aren't there. They never spend time there. But for some of them on an acceleration, on more joint compliance, on things where it's longer ground contact times, I am going to really focus on those. So you're always kind of weighing what's the costs and benefits, what's the risk reward for some of these things. It's having a really heavy, I used to work with throwers, for instance. There's certain stiffness qualities that are there, but I'm not losing any sleep over their flying 30, I'm just not. They don't run anywhere. So why am I going to be changing their program based on that? So Yeah, it's always kind of a weighing of what exercises are we doing that dictate, what are our assessments for each of these? Where are their gaps? And is that really important for them to have gaps? A high-end sprinter is probably not going to have like especially a 200 or a really elastic kind of guy. They're probably not going to be super strong in an absolute sense, but are they strong enough? Can we get away with what we have, and what's the least amount that we need? Because you don't want to dampen them down. Hypertrophy work and absolute strength work, that's going to dampen those greyhounds down, and you're going to really start taking away from what makes them special in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's the third time I want to say in 7 panels we've heard the phrase "keep the main thing the main thing." So it's a commonality, and I like what you said, Dan, about zooming out and seeing the big picture when it comes to this athlete, especially in team sport. Right, especially in team sport. The sport skill is likely the most important factor, right? Is the most important factor, how good at their actual sport. So understanding that when you can dive deep into maybe one measurement or one data point, but then being able to zoom out and see how that fits in the big picture, I really like that. So thank you both for your input on that. Go ahead, Dan.
And I just wanted to add one more thing. Like I think it was brought up earlier of a lot of times to kind of isolate, especially in team sports, if you talk to the position coach or even the athlete, they'll be able to tell you where they need to improve, and then you can start saying, well, what are my exercises and assessments that might be related to some of these qualities? Because you're right, the sport's the most important thing. So if they can't hold some of these positions in an isometric sense, maybe absolute strength is one of those things. But, a lot of times it's dialogue, because in team sports, it's just not that clean. It's pretty muddy. There's Larry Bird was not the most twitchy, but that dude could ball, right? Like he knew how to play basketball, and that's what made him special, right? So each athlete's their own thing, but the people who know the sport know why they're good or why they're not, and what's going to hold them back.
Absolutely. And one of the things I want to talk about, we started to hit on it just a little bit, is the never forgotten about strength training. So Ramsey, I'm going to start with you, and then we'll go over to Dan. When considering your annual training plan or even writing a specific mesocycle, how do you marry your plyometric training with your strength training? Are there certain emphases based on the positions, the planes, or intensities for that day, or a certain quality you're trying, to go after? And what have you found to be most effective when it comes to the strength training combined with plyometric training?
Yeah, I mean, there's always some level of vertical integration going on, right? Like, we're always working on all this stuff. I don't break it down by, I don't separate them by a day, right? If it's, for example, early on in our off season, they're basically separate. So you come in and in different blocks, you're not going to be doing strength training, traditional resistance training with your plyometrics or your snap downs or any of that. Those things kind of progress on their own separately. It's like, we're going to get through this stuff. Early on, you're going to come in, like, before we even touch a weight, you're going to knock out your snap downs. You're going to be doing your jump rope. You're going to be, and we're progressing those through these months. And then you get in your traditional training. And that's basically how it sits through the off season. And then these things start to kind of come together a little bit in a sense of, we'll make you very strong in July, and then hopefully pay attention in August when you go home. And then when you come back in September, we're going to find out if you did that, because I'm going to basically go back to my July. My last week of July looks like my last week of August, because I just want to know if you did anything at home, right? But once we build once we have confidence in these underpinning qualities, like, can you produce force now? Can you absorb force or produce force eccentrically now, right? Can you control this? Is there a motor pattern here? Do you have work capacity to recover in between sets? Can you last all week? All of those things are going to kind of develop. And then they begin to merge as we get closer to season, right? It's the idea of like your GPP versus your kind of sport specific prep. And as we get closer to season, it starts to look like, and they start to blend and marry like a complex training model. So I'm a big kind of, and I wouldn't even say, I don't even know if PAP is happening, right? This idea of post-activation potentiation, like, I'm not measuring calcium ions. I don't know. I just know that if we built force and you're strong enough, you won't be buried by the force work that we're doing, because we're moving that toward a speed strength or a strength speed kind of model anyways, right? So you're not going to get buried from the resistance. And then our snap downs have kind of been removed already, or so the way I introduce some of our jumping stuff is like a seated box jump is our first big one. I'm going to remove the stretch shortening cycle. I'm going to remove the landing. I just want to know propulsively, can you jump? And then eventually those things come together. Now you got a counter movement with it to a box jump. And then shocker, we're going to go depth jump after that. We'll probably do a step in first. And all these things kind of begin to come together. And now we're a month out from season and you're hitting some speed squats and that's paired with a depth jump. And it's like, well, how do we get there? Well, we just kind of progressed super logically, not fancy, wouldn't look good on Instagram, but come day one, I'm going to be confident that we're ready. So they basically, to answer your question directly, through June, July, and August, they sit separately, they kind of move separately. And then in September and October, they begin to merge and marry like a complex training model so that we can kind of peak come November when season starts.
Yeah. I really like to go I think the vertical integration. I mean, the Charlie Francis system of, okay, what's your GPP look like? I'm a big movement diversity guy at that time. A lot of these guys can get so bound up in single plane or such consistent movements or favoring the same thing. I think a lot of times an overuse injury could be looked at as a lack of movement diversity and a lack of stress to opposing or supportive tissues. So I think that's a time that you start to build that in. And then it starts to just get kind of nuanced in terms of like, if you're looking for, if you're trying to move the needle, there's certain elements that you can't train that frequently. If you're going to hit absolute strength or hypertrophy, that's probably and it's probably a twice a week thing per body part, whatever you're looking at, but if it's a motor coding or a motor unit thing, and especially at low volumes, you can do that pretty frequently. So I've gotten more and more into especially considering the fact that if we're looking for motor unit recruitment and we're looking for maximum outputs, you really want to be paying attention to, well, how, if we're looking at the omega wave, the fluid periodization model, you want them to be fresh. But in team sports, not everyone's going to be fresh all the time. So what you can get away with is some lower doses at some really high qualities before they get fatigued and before they get too beaten down. So, things like a snap down, things like a rudiment, things like certain plyos might be in the program or in the part of the warm up all the time. When I was at that D3, we ran the football team. We did some acceleration work every single day. Some. Now it might have been a 10 to 20. That's it. But at least we're polishing the car a little bit, right? And then there are other times that we really want to hit the gas. But I think to that point, there are certain elements that you kind of keep in there, but it's just like a minimal dose. And then there are other pieces that just kind of marry well. Absolute strength is going to marry fairly well with a longer stretch shortening cycle kind of movement, or if you're kind of marrying certain patterns, and then you can contrast it or complex it with some of these higher motor unit movements. Hypertrophy phases fatigue elastic elements. So that might be something that if you're going to get any elastic work, get low dose, get a little bit in just to kind of keep that motor program going, but then you're going to do some things that aren't going to be great for that specific component. So like, that's another piece. If you're doing any sort of elastic testing, you got to understand the elastic athletes are not going to do well during that time. And that's just got to be planned. Like if you expect it, that's fine. But then as you progress through to strength and more high motor unit recruitments, more power phases, then it starts to build in of the high strength, heavy compliance, heavy weights. Then we're starting to deal with more compliance structures, starting to introduce some power. And then kind of like Ramsey's saying, then it all kind of blends together. Then it's multiple response, power training, really elastic velocity-based work. Cue that I use all the time with plyos is just violence. Just always violence. You don't want, there's a certain time to be really controlled. There's a certain time for violence. And then in season, it kind of follows a track model, in my opinion, especially if you're fortunate. It's a little different if you're multiple sports, multiple games a week versus in a situation where if you have one big game a week, well, then you can have a time where it's a little lower. And then towards the end of the week, maybe you're doing some accelerated jumps, some med balls, some really light resisted things that it's a more of a velocity focus that's going to speed up the nervous system, use it as a primer day and go from there. But those are times that you just kind of got to, as a practitioner, constantly be assessing where are these athletes at? Because if they're trashed and they did a long road trip and they got back and you had a heavy day or a high plyo day, you might be digging a hole deeper than what you want, and that's kind of these plyometrics are pretty, they're a powerful stimulus, but they got to be done well,
Yeah, I think a lot of human performance professionals would agree, right? The off season, plyometrics really important. We got to make sure that we do that. I think as you head into the in season, that becomes a little bit more opaque. With your respective sports, and Dan, you just started to hit on it a little bit. I'm gonna go to Ramsey and then Dan, give you another chance to kind of hit on it some more if you want. Ramsey, I know in basketball, this is kind of often talked about as the in-season plyometric training. I know in talking with a lot of professionals, some do a little bit in low doses. Some will perform some depth drops every few weeks. What does your in-season plyometric training look like as you start from kind of the beginning of the season and then towards the end? And Dan, again, mentioned, I'm giving him credit for this, is just talking with the athletes right on that specific day, but removing that and looking at more, okay, bigger picture. This is what an ideal scenario I'd like to do. What does that in-season plyometric training look like for your basketball athletes?
Yeah, we do a little bit of it. And by a little bit, I mean, it could be a day where you're getting, if it's our jumps, you're getting anywhere from 10 to maybe 25 jumps on the high end. And that's regress based off of effort and intent and maybe what we're doing. But we do a little bit because in season gives us plenty of repetitions at this stuff, but we can go a week or two without high outputs. And so it's like, I want a max effort, occasionally from my guys. And so I don't just let it sit on hoping it happened on the basketball court or hoping it happened in a game. And then obviously there's a further breakdown to half my team doesn't even play, right? Your rotations are I shouldn't say they don't play. They play, obviously, they practice a ton. In college, we practice a ton. But when your rotations get cut to 7 or 8, it's like, well, some of you, we probably should be in here jumping our asses off because we can make progress. Or if nothing else, let's expose these high efforts because you're not getting them necessarily in a game anyways. But even our high jumpers, like our high minute guys who are jumping through the through the roof, we have guys that could jump 40 inches. It's still not uncommon for them to be in season doing a box split squat jump with a max effort. And when they don't try, I get on their ass, right? And so we still want those things, but volume's so low that I'm not expecting you to necessarily increase your vertical during this time. And we don't do a ton of speed stuff once season hits. I'm not working on acceleration during season. Like we get those from practice. Like we may not jump as high as we can all the time, but you're going to sprint your butt off all the time, whether it's practice or a game. So some of that stuff we don't do, but we do jump during season.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thanks, Dan. Anything you'd like to add?
No, I think you got it right there. I mean, it's just, again, it's an equation of, are these the high minute, low minute athletes? Are they? And then, I mean, a common one, we all know this, anyone who's practiced with or been a practitioner with team sports, sometimes athletes are going to come in and they're going to have knee tendonitis. Their feet are going to be jacked up. Maybe their plyo or their power is going to be a hard isometric that day. Because at the end, like you said, at the end of the day, we got to get them ready for the game. My exercises don't matter if they aren't ready for the game. So, I think that's the big, doing a lot of box stuff, like you're saying, Ramsey, of things, because they're getting a lot of impacts. There's no shortage of impacts and decelerations and violent movements out on the court or out on the field. It's really trying to find areas where you can fill in gaps, if there are gaps to fill in, or like you said, try to just get them to touch that ceiling so that if they're playing at 80%, what's the old thing, like they spend most of their time in that 80 to 85% mark, let's keep that at 80, 85%. They don't have to get up to 90 just to hit what used to be their 80, right? Like keep that ceiling there through just be intelligent about it in ways that aren't going to aggravate them. Yeah,
completely. Yeah, I always think exposure. Can we expose to 90% of an effort on these things? And then we'll probably keep the ceiling around where it is. The caveat that I would add is I'm fortunate now from the programming side that all of my guys are between the ages of 18 and 24 and they're young, resilient bodies that can handle a lot of stuff, and it's college and we're going to push you, versus the NBA. It's a different conversation. So whatever I said today, just know it probably is with the lens of like, my guys are 18 to 24, haven't had a lot of training background. We could push them a lot. And if they complain, I tell them to suck it up and we just keep going. Like, right. That's where I'm at now. And so some of these responses would obviously be different in different environments.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I appreciate the feedback on all the questions we've had to this point. I want to give our attendees a chance to ask some questions. I know some people already put some questions in the chat, so we're going to get to them. If you have any more questions and you're listening in, feel free to share that in the chat and we'll try to get to all of them. We'll answer them in order. So Mike, why don't you go ahead and start to address some of those things?
Awesome. Dan, Ramsey, great talk on plyometrics. Definitely learned a lot. So thanks for sharing your insights. We did touch on this technology briefly. I'll start with you, Ramsey, and then Dan, going to you. This question's coming in from, say, Kulik. Opinion on using My Jump 2 app to measuring jumps and other variables, and maybe elaborate on some other technologies that you guys would recommend. I know, Ramsey, you talked about Vertec, you talked about ForceX, but maybe there's some other tech as well as My Jump 2, especially if you don't have the budget for some organizations or universities. So Ramsey, to you first.
Yeah, big fan of the My Jump app, and actually the suite of apps. I think, is that Carlos Basbon that makes all the apps? I think he makes those apps. Big fan though in general of his apps, because you're a sports scientist on a mobile phone at that point. It can be challenging to use in a high volume athlete setting because it is a slow-mo camera and you have to go frame by frame and piece out when the foot contact happened. So, but in general, big fan. Other tech that you can use, obviously if you're talking measuring jumps, there's a Vertec. I'm also a big fan of actually just jump mats. I wouldn't necessarily trust the data for the height to be accurate, but you can trust that it's going to improve the outputs. Like, guys are going to try because it's so easy to compete. And that's one, some of the force plate technologies now have created some faster softwares that allow us to kind of jump, then you could speak to, you probably can get through 50 athletes pretty quick on certain, if you got like the force tech jump going or whatever. But in general, I think, just ultimately don't use technology as a crutch, but use it to influence programming and ultimately make it better. Your iPhone is a good one though, literally a slow-mo camera. If you're seeing something that I mentioned earlier, I sound like the guy who's like backtracking. I mentioned earlier that we used to use a tablet, and I'm not saying coach through the damn camera, but if you see somebody that clearly they got a bad angle, or they're whatever, their knees diving in, or they're taking forever to get off the ground, or you see a trunk sway, it could be as quick as like, hold on, do that again. And then just show it to them. And that alone is good visual feedback. We know from the data that feedback can improve outcome, right? If you give someone an output alone, you can improve power by 10% just by telling them what just happened. So, but I can't think of many like cheap apps or cheap technology, but if you can track a bar speed, if you have a camera on your phone, this is probably it, honestly, because there's apps for that too. I just remembered. So yeah, use your iPhone.
Yeah, I'm in the same, but I mean, it's the old quote, if it looks right, it flies right, right? Like with when you're dealing with ballistics and the high velocities and the high forces that are coming with plyometrics, joint position and postures really, really matter. And if the athlete and from side, from rear, from front, whatever, the slow motion camera is so valuable for that. And just to bring them onto the same page, these are all visual athletes, they're very kinesthetic learners. So that's a great avenue to go down. And I do enjoy the my sprint and the my jump. Then you're kind of getting back to the issues with the force velocity that Ramsey touched on earlier. Is like you're measuring a squat jump, not necessarily measuring an elastic or a dynamic jump sometimes. And so it's like that each assessment has its holes, right? But if you have a technical model that you're going towards, like what does a good rep look like for you? Okay, the knees are in line with the second toe, the shin angle and torso angle are roughly similar. Like if you can start checking off the boxes as you move through these exercises visually, and then, okay, let's video this. I either need to go through it or the athlete needs to see what I'm talking about. In terms of something low cost, like I think the force plates are very, 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 very valuable. I think you can really get a lot out of them. But also I was a Division III strength coach, and like asking for like a budget for a Vertec was like a big ask. So I get that. So then you're dealing with, you got to just sharpen up that coach's eye, and that camera is really, really valuable for that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, sorry, just to jump in it, because I'm just always sensitive to people on a budget, right? Or coaches on a budget. Like, you can literally, in our weight room, there's tape that's hanging from the ceiling, and it's marked with heights. Is it good for testing? I mean, if you had enough pieces of tape, sure. But is it good for training? If you're in an environment where you can't get a Vertec, hang anything from the ceiling. It doesn't matter. As long as you can somehow measure the height, get a ladder out. I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud, like put a tennis ball on something and have them hit, and then move it a little higher. And then it goes back to earlier, we talked about internal, external cueing. Like that's an external cue now. So don't get too caught up in the testing that you forget to train for performance. I think, that's a deeper discussion, but
And just one point to finish with that I think you're exactly right on. I would rather have cheap equipment and tape that is done well consistently than, oh, I did a force plate jump back in September and we're trying to make decisions off it here in December. Like that's a totally different athlete then, like if you can do something consistently and track it over time, because half the time they don't care what the test is. They want to know if they're getting better, and you want to know if they're getting better. So if you're doing something consistently as part of the training and then you're kind of covering different avenues like we've talked about, you have a lot of control over the process. Like you do not need a lot of, you don't need a 1080 to know a lot of these things. If the athlete looks like they're running better, if you have some better timers or whatever, anymore with the apps, you don't even need the timers,
Great. Awesome. Yeah. I think you guys were spot on. Technology's just a tool, just adding it to your toolbox and helping make educated decisions, but it's not the end all be all. We have two more really good questions. Dan, I'm coming to you first on this one. This is coming from Scott. It's a little bit of a lengthy question, so if I need to repeat, feel free, but it's a great question. When it comes to return to play, where you're redeveloping capacity, are there any underlying tissue specific adaptations you're chasing with your plyos? If so, are you tracking those changes, or do you view this as more of a neuromuscular training approach where when they own it, they are good?
And that's a good question. And kind of to Ramsey's point, like I'm not ultrasounding it to answer it, in the most direct sense. That's something where I'm going to lean on the professionals and the athletic medicine side. And, obviously a lot of this stuff in the return to play and the training staff have to be lockstep. If you're off kilter there or someone's cleared to run, but they aren't cleared to do basic jumps, like these things aren't adding up. Right. So I would lean on them to say, okay, are we to a point where the tissue can tolerate at least very introductory loading? And then then we're back to the first plyometrics, their feet might not leave the ground. They might just be dropping down in a controlled stance. Can they maintain that position? And then from there, I think it's just with the return to play, you have to keep your eye on the joint angles. Because again, if they're a good athlete, they can compensate around it. And if they're competitive, they will throw technique out the window to try to jump higher, get back to a mark that they used to be. So that's something where we got to make sure that then it becomes a game of, we have to build exercises to force them into positions where they have to handle those forces at that tissue in a very progressive long-term stretch. Because again, what's nice about these things is intensity is the driver with plyometrics and return to play. Volume can get you part of the way, but at a certain point they got to hit that ceiling, and that's what's going to start moving the needle from a neurological standpoint and from guarding, for them to be able to trust what they're dealing with. So I would say I trust it from the athletic medicine staff that, okay, this person is ready to get back to training. And then I am very, very judicious and cautious and progressing. I'm it might be, we'll start only vertical snap downs today. And then, okay, maybe next time we'll do 2 vertical double leg. Let's try a single leg, and if it looks terrible, we're bailing on it right now. And we're going back to what we're good at, because we still we want to just perfect training matters and hitting really good quality positions and postures within and how you to tolerate force. That's how you can start to mitigate some of the re-injury risk. Because I think a lot of the re-injury risk comes from the athlete can hit their same triple hop for distance. They can hit their same vert from beforehand, but they still might be favoring the other leg by 30% or whatever it is, So then you're overloading the one leg, your other leg is never really getting loaded, and they get cleared, and then we cross our fingers. And so I think that it's position right away, but being very, very cautious and kind of leaning on that medicine staff, and just, again, hyper communication with the athlete. Are they hurting? Are they sore? Does that feel all right? Does it not feel all right? Are they comfortable with it? Are they not? All these pieces all go into play on how, I was talking with a guy, any return to play program that I help organize, it's a week at a time. I'll put out a week at a time with goals. I'm not going to build out a 4-week program because I don't know where they're going to be in 2. So it's a lot, very, very adaptable because everyone's going to have a little different refractory curves and different adaptation curves on these things.
Ramsey, anything to add?
No, I mean, I completely agree with Dan. I think you mentioned like one thing there, maybe in week 2, you go to 2 bilateral snap downs, and then you throw a unilateral in. And I thought what you mentioned is coaching, right? You said, and if it doesn't look good, we're removing it right there on the spot. I think a lot of return to play, your return to play needs to obviously have a bird's eye view progression and where we want to go. And then you mentioned like, people get cleared and we cross our fingers. And it's like, that's actually, you mentioned it because you know how common it is in sport, right? And it's like, it's ridiculous. You should never ever return an athlete and cross your finger. And obviously, Dan, you weren't saying you do, but that happens in our industry. And it's like, my rehab approach is pretty simple. Let's say you tear a hamstring. Well, before we clear you, I'm going to try to tear your hamstring off in the weight room. And then I'm going to try to tear it off on the practice court. And then when it doesn't tear, I'm going to have confidence that you can play in a game. And then I'm not going to cross my fingers. And I think that should probably be where we get to. But to Dan's point, like, I don't ultrasound anyone. We don't MRI anybody. But I would argue that if you're in a high level environment, for example, the NFL, NBA, and you have some very specific use cases, like players who get $50 million a year, I would definitely do all of those things because it's so easy to do and the price is justified. And that's a conversation for another day.
Love it. Great insight. I just want to quickly get to our last question. This is coming from Raphael. Any recommended books, resources on plyometric training, maybe people to listen to or kind of chime in, podcasts and stuff like that? So Ramsey, I'll go to you first, and then Dan, feel free to chime in with any resources, and then I'm going to Gabe to wrap it up. So thank you.
Yeah, quick one, easy one that I would give out. I'm a big fan of Lauren Landau. And on YouTube, he has some resources on plyometrics. So go to YouTube, type Lauren Landau plyometrics, and anything that pops up with him in it, I would watch it.
Yeah, he's awesome. I mean, I think the old Charlie Francis books had great diagrams of how you mirror what are the compatible training elements that we're looking at. I think a lot of value comes from the people who do the return to play because the technical aspect is really important. So anything by Dan Paff, anything from Bouchek Snyder, like they same deal. You can go on YouTube and see how these guys have laid a lot of these things out, and you can really learn a lot. And then a lot of times it'll point you into other directions.
Yeah, I listen to Boo stuff all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I love every time I hear a different lecture or something like that. I just, you walk away with something, which is awesome. So some tremendous resources. Thanks for those. I have 2 questions. One is on the topics of plyometrics, and one is a different question, which we'll finish with. The last one for plyos, and for lack of a better term, incorporating non-traditional plyometrics. So do you introduce any multi-surface, slanted surface plyometrics, or maybe creative positions that are more sport demand relevant in your plyometrics? And I'll start with Ramsey, then go to Dan. Ramsey, I think I watched a presentation you filmed on your driveway, right? The slant of the driveway. I can remember some of the hopping that you showed on that. So that kind of opened my mind to some of the kind of slant things. And now you're seeing, I think, more videos, at least on social media, of some slant boards that are out there and things like that. So, and maybe even barefoot, anything that you incorporate in your training that's kind of, quote, non-traditional plyometrics?
Yeah, we don't do a ton of it. We'll do like, I just call them multi-pogos. They put one foot on the bench, the back leg is behind them extended, not overly extended, but just extended enough. And I just tell them to just hop around. Like, I don't really care where you go, because we're just trying to load the foot and the Achilles tendon at these different angles that we know are probably important in general. But that's really the length of that. You can get crazy, obviously, on social media, but that's about as creative as I get with that stuff. I think regardless of what you do, because I'm a fan of it, I think it makes sense. But just think extensive, think low amplitude, think higher volumes, but lower intensities. Don't do anything that's high intent on a surface that you're not ready for. And for the most part, your athlete's probably not gonna be on that surface anyway. So, let's keep it a little more traditional, but yeah, that's all we do.
Yeah. I'm the same way. I think when for like the most creative that I'll get to is something where it's like a late stage rehab. Again, it's problem solving too, right? Like a knee athlete, I might have them kind of do a quarter squat knee bend on a single leg, start doing some repeat jumps, and then I might start pushing them. I might behind them and just add some chaos to it where they don't know where the perturbation's coming from, but their foot has to react and start to kind of make it more reflexive. Whereas someone with a lower leg or ankle, maybe we're doing some extensive things in the sand. But yeah, I mean, these are high force movements. You don't want to throw a whole lot of gas on that fire, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks. Always interesting to see kind of what's out there, and appreciate that feedback. And I like what you said right there, Dan, the chaos kind of later. And that goes back to what Ramsey said in the beginning, which was that control before chaos. So bringing those things together. So last question we have for you, I want to be mindful of the time and really appreciative of it, is it's everything. It's a question we like to ask all of our guest panelists that join us here is, what does your own training look like right now? And are you practicing what you preach to your athletes? Or are you training for something specific? Or are you experimenting? What does that look like? And we'll start with Dan and finish with Ramsey.
Sometimes my training is sad anymore. Like it's just, sometimes I'm just hitting a 1x20 block and I'm just getting in and getting out. If I got 20 minutes, I'm getting 20 minutes. If I'm really on it, now it's warm. So I've been trying to do more hiking and get outside. If I'm on it, I'm on a good yoga practice, but I will mix in. I love hill sprints. I'll do a hardcore lower body day if I'm feeling up to it. I'll do some bodybuilding because I think a lot of us got into it because we like some bodybuilding stuff. So, I mix it up anymore. I think a lot of us would agree. I'm a pretty big hypocrite on it, where I'll make a plan and I'll put a lot of emphasis on it. But then like, if I'm not feeling it, I'll get my journal out and I'll just make what I want to do that day, So
Dan does a lot of calf raising.
I microdose biceps every day. That's the most important.
We're all guilty of that. Ramsey, what's going on over there?
Yeah, I mean, mine's pretty easy. I got a vacation in Tulum coming up first week of August, so it's basically going to be tank top workouts until then, and then probably when I get back, I'll have more fun with my training. But right now, I'm basically just trying to get as big as I can for that.
Oh, that's great. It's always really fun to hear what people have to say. We've had some really interesting answers. So we appreciate that. And it's always fun to hear. So enjoy that vacation in Tulum. I'm sure it's well earned. So we can really talk about this all night, but that is the time that we have for tonight. A huge thank you to our attendees that joined us live for the K.E.S. A huge thank you to our two panelists, Dan Riddenhauer and Dr. Ramsey Nigem. We appreciate their time and all the knowledge they shared with us tonight. Please be sure to give them both a follow on social media. Dan on Twitter, Ramsey on Twitter and Instagram. We'll include their handles in the info along with a link to the Applied Performance Coach certification and mentorship. This discussion will be publicly available on the Keiserfitness YouTube page, and the audio will be up on Spotify as well under the Keiser Education Series. We hope you'll join us in 2 weeks from now for our final K.E.S. panel for the spring summer of 2022. Thank you, everybody, and have a great night.
Appreciate it, guys.